Hello and welcome to the Storeroom of Scripture. I'm Jeff Johnson. Today we're looking at Daniel chapter 11, verses 21 through 31. These verses continue the cryptic history of the tensions between Seleucid Syria and Ptolemaic Egypt. The last lesson brought us to the end of the reign of Seleucus IV. Verse 21 introduces us to Antiochus IV, and the focus will stay on him from this point forward. The atrocities of Antiochus IV are also the focus of the intertestamental book of 1 Maccabees. I will introduce that book and key passages from it to add context to the history given in Daniel. The last verse we look at today describes the pinnacle of blasphemy imposed by Antiochus IV on the Jews, an altar to Olympian Zeus built directly on top of the altar to Yahweh in the temple in Jerusalem. That desecration of sacred space earned the infamous nickname, the abomination that causes desolation. Thank you for joining me as we continue our study in Daniel chapter 11. Today we're continuing with Daniel chapter 11. We're going to get through another set of verses. Chapter 11 is so full of sketch outlines about some really interesting details of the tensions between the Seleucid kings and the Ptolemaic kings. The Ptolemies being the kings of Egypt after Alexander the Great, and the Seleucids being the kings of what we would call Syria, or was at the time Syria. And then, of course, between Egypt and Syria is Palestine, where Jerusalem are and the Jews, and so they get caught up between these two factions over and over again. And so in verses 1 through 20 of Daniel, we saw a broad sweep from the Alexander taking over from the Persians and then following. I am going to follow the same pattern as I did last week, where I'm going to just read the verse as it's originally written, and then I'm going to replace the pronouns or ambiguous references with the historical figures that scholars are generally agreed. Anyway, back to verse 21. In his place a despicable person will arise, on whom they have not conferred the majesty of the kingdom, and he will come in without warning, and he will seize the kingdom by deceit. So we read that first hymn as Seleucus IV. In Seleucus IV's place a despicable person, Antiochus IV Epiphanes, will arise. And that's who we're going to be discussing at least through 35, verse 35. Some will say that we're going to discuss Antiochus IV through the end of the chapter. And it's that point in verse 35 and 36 where we decide, are we still talking about Antiochus IV or not? But from this point through verse 35, the main character, if you will, is going to be Antiochus IV, known as Epiphanes. Now, what about these notes, whom they have not conferred the majesty of the kingdom? Well, although Antiochus IV was part of the royal family, he was not the next in line to succeed Seleucus IV. That would have been Seleucus IV's son, Demetrius. Antiochus was the Roman hostage. Antiochus IV was the Roman hostage during Seleucus IV's reign. He was on his way home exchanged for another member of the royal family when Seleucus IV was killed. It must have had something to do with this whole financial arrangement, that they would take a significant member of the royal family, basically hold him against his will, sort of like house arrest, except not at his house, but in Rome. I think their Roman accommodations were not like prison. They were comfortably appointed, but in Rome, not at home. So when Antiochus gets back to Syria, he takes the throne and sends Demetrius to Rome as the next Roman hostage. So Demetrius ought to have succeeded his father as the next king, but instead he gets sent to Rome as the next hostage. And Antiochus takes over as the next king. Somebody of the royal family was taken back to Rome in this process, but instead of it being somebody else, it was Demetrius who should have been made king next. But Antiochus took that spot. So that's why he hadn't been conferred the majesty of the kingdom. It wasn't his place to be the next king, but he did become so. and he will seize the kingdom by deceit. Apparently, Antiochus was able to avoid this, or able to take the kingdom, because he made deals with other members of the royal family. And we know he took bribes in order to elevate people under him. There's the idea that Antiochus IV was actually one of the co-conspirators in the death of Seleucus IV. So Antiochus may have been dealing on the side this whole time. History doesn't give us a detailed plot as far as how Antiochus got to be king instead of Demetrius, and how Demetrius ended up on the ship back to Rome. But all of that had to have been done with some double dealing that Antiochus was doing at the time. What we do know about one bit of deceit that happened early on in Antiochus' reign was that he took a bribe from a man named Jason, whose brother, Onias III, was the high priest in the Temple of Israel. And Jason paid Antiochus, and as a result, Antiochus detained Onias III so that he could not continue to be the high priest, and Jason took that spot. So that's a bit of double dealing that hit Jerusalem and the Israelites directly, was with this buying off the priesthood, the high priest slot, with Antiochus and Jason. Verse 22. Before him, mighty military forces will be utterly swept away, and they will be broken, and also the leader of the covenant. Well, again, him is Antiochus IV. We don't have a historical record of a mighty military force opposing Antiochus when he became king. It seemed mostly double dealing and side deals that got him into the kingship. However, there were certainly military forces that could have opposed him, but none of them apparently did. So he was able to take the kingdom despite the military option that was on the table, and yet wasn't used against Antiochus. He just became king. And the leader of the covenant is understood by most to be Onias III, the high priest, who was ousted. He wasn't killed, but he was detained so that he couldn't continue in his role as high priest. So his brother Jason took that position. So that's understood to be this leader of the covenant being set aside and broken by Antiochus IV. In verse 23, and after an alliance is made with him, he will act deceitfully, and he will rise, and he will become powerful with few people backing him. So this alliance, it's not clear who Daniel is referring to here when it says an alliance is made with him and he will act deceitfully, mainly because that seemed to be a status quo for Antiochus. Making a deal and then breaking it was sort of Antiochus's MO. So there were lots of people we could fit in this slot. Of one point, though, is that Jason, who paid off Antiochus in order to become the high priest, was outbid by another guy named Menelaus, who also wanted to be high priest and apparently had more money, paid Antiochus more than Jason did, and so Antiochus took Jason out and put Menelaus in as the high priest. So at this point, the high priesthood of Israel is a commodity to be bought. That is one reason why the people of Israel were so angry with Antiochus, that he was playing politics with their spiritual leader. The high priest of the temple was a position that could be bought, and Menelaus did. Now, in verse 24, the first part of verse 24, it says, in a time of ease and in the rich parts of the province, he will come and he will do what his predecessors did not do. He will distribute plunder and spoil and possessions to them. Now, of course, this is again Antiochus IV doing with this. I'm not going to replace all of the pronouns going forward, because most of the time he is going to be Antiochus IV. If that ever is not him, I will clarify. But this was Antiochus IV. He was apparently generous with his supporters. If you were on Antiochus' side and supported him, he returned the favor with money and positions of influence. So he was generous with supporters. And here we will start to see some connections with the book of 1st Maccabees. I don't know if you've heard of 1st and 2nd Maccabees. They're part of the apocryphal tradition. And so they are in Catholic Bibles, in that middle testament between the Old Testament and the New Testament are these books of Apocrypha. 1st and 2nd Maccabees are in there. And so some Christian traditions see it as scripture. Maybe they don't hold it up to the same height as the Old and New Testaments, but they view them as a part of the testimony of the church. Not all traditions, Protestants do not. So in the Protestant tradition, we did not have these apocryphal books, mainly because they were not included in the Masoretic copying of the Old Testament. The Masoretes, when they put together their Old Testament scriptures in the Hebrew language, did not include these apocryphal texts, including 1st and 2nd Maccabees. However, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, the Septuagint, that was made 200 or 300 years before Christ, actually during this time of the Ptolemies in Greece. So while the Ptolemies were in control of Palestine, the Jews made a copy of the Old Testament in Greek, because that's what everybody spoke at the time. So it was the language of the people. They translated the Bible into Greek, and these apocryphal books, including 1st and 2nd Maccabees, were part of the Septuagint tradition, not part of the Masoretic tradition, and that's why the Protestants don't include them, because we base our Old Testament on the Masoretic text. Just some background information for why they're there sometimes and not others. But 1st and 2nd Maccabees, most people understand that they were written at about this same time, and they record Antiochus as the king and what he did in Israel. And so I'm going to refer to some passages from 1st Maccabees about this situation. And Antiochus's generosity with supporters is actually documented in that book. So in 1st Maccabees, in chapter 3, I'm just going to pick out two verses, verse 28 and verse 30. It talks about Antiochus specifically being generous with supporters. In verse 28 we read, "And he opened his treasury and gave provisions to his force for the year, and ordered them to be ready for every need of the year." And in verse 30, it says, "And he was afraid that he would not have as much as once and twice before for the expenses and the gifts that he had previously given with an abundant hand." So Antiochus was, by this time, by 1st Maccabees chapter 3, was worried that he couldn't be as generous as he had been because his resources were not as full at the time. But it shows a pattern that Antiochus had been generous as he could be with his military and the other supporters that he had. So he was generous with his friends and supporters. Now back in Daniel, in the last half of verse 24 and the first part of verse 25, it says, "He will devise his plans against fortifications, but only for a time, and he will stir up his power and his heart against the king of the south, and with a much greater and stronger army." So here is Antiochus IV. He devises plans against the Egyptian fortifications, to be perfectly clear, but only for a time, and he will stir up his power and his heart against Ptolemy VI, Philometor, and with a much greater and stronger army. So this gets a little bit confusing. It sounds like Antiochus IV is the instigator here, but he's actually responding to a threat that Ptolemy VI had made about invading Palestine and taking that area. It was Ptolemy's idea. He invaded Palestine with some really bad advice to do it at this time, but Antiochus had the stronger army to oppose Ptolemy VI. And then the last half of verse 25 and verse 26 says, "But he will not succeed, for they will devise plans against him, and those who eat of his royal rations will break him, and his army will be overwhelmed, and many will fall slain." This is really a confusing use of pronouns, because the he here, you would think, is Antiochus IV, because he typically is in this whole thing. And as verse 24 reads, it sounds like he's the instigator of the situation. But historically, it doesn't make sense for that to be Antiochus, for historically that's Ptolemy VI, the king of the south, who is the most recently used name, the king of the south, before this pronoun. So it does work grammatically to say that this he is Ptolemy and not Antiochus, but it's kind of tricky as you're reading through this. It's easy to think that this is talking about Antiochus' failure, but it's not. It's talking about Ptolemy VI's failure in this invasion, this ill-advised invasion. There were a couple of people, Eulaeus and Linnaeus, who were advisors to Ptolemy VI. They were actually on his side, his advisors, who told him that this would be a good time to invade Syria and Palestine. It was the terrible advice. That's why the writer here says they will devise plans against him. It was such bad advice, it's as if they were trying to get him in trouble, trying to put him in a compromised position. It was so bad. Now, there's no evidence that they were actually trying to do it. They were just really stupid advisors, apparently, to advise him to do this at this time. And so the attempt to retake Palestine by Ptolemy VI completely failed. And in fact, Ptolemy VI was taken hostage by Antiochus as a part of this process. When he failed on the battlefield, Antiochus was able to seize Ptolemy VI and take him into captivity as a prisoner. So that's why it's really bad advice. Then in verse 27, "And two of the kings will bend their hearts to evil, and at the same table they will speak lies, but what is discussed will not succeed, for still an end is coming at the appointed time." So who are two of the kings? Probably it'd be better worded just to say the two kings, because this is Antiochus IV and Ptolemy VI. So after Antiochus takes Ptolemy into captivity, or as his own prisoner of war, he talks to him. Ptolemy VI is the son of his sister Cleopatra. He's his nephew. All Cleopatra's kids are Antiochus' nephews because of that political marriage that they made, that his father made, or his grandfather made when he sent Cleopatra over there to Egypt. So they're all related now through Cleopatra. So this is his nephew, Ptolemy VI is his nephew, that he is talking about. Now, what we don't see here in the scripture is that Ptolemy VI's brother takes over the kingdom. He's not Ptolemy VI until his brother is taken into captivity, and then he is crowned as the next king of Egypt. So Antiochus sees this as an opportunity to pit the two brothers against each other, his nephews. He plots with Ptolemy VI to say, look, well, I took you over here as my guest in Syria, and your brother takes over the kingdom while you're gone. How is that for a brother? And so Antiochus and Ptolemy start making plans. And apparently Ptolemy was going with him. And yet the writer here in Daniel suggests that they're both being double-faced in this conversation. They're just speaking lies to each other. Antiochus is lying to Ptolemy, saying that he has his best interest at heart, because really Antiochus only ever has Antiochus' interest at heart. So he's lying to Ptolemy VI. Ptolemy VI is lying to Antiochus that he's going to go along with this. And whatever it is that they planned, is not going to pan out. And not just because they're both lying, but because it is not the appointed time yet for certain things to happen. And so Antiochus and Ptolemy might plot all they want, but what God is going to plan is going to take place, and it is not yet the appointed time. If there's one theme to these verses and all of this machinations between the king of the south and the king of the north, is that God is always ultimately in control. And these kings plotting with each other and against each other can't change that. What God is going to happen is going to happen. In verse 28, then he will return to his land with many possessions, but his heart will be set against the holy covenant, and he will take action, and he will return to his land. So this is Antiochus IV, who he was succeeding in his Egyptian. I mean, he took Ptolemy VI into captivity, and then he was succeeding in Egypt. And then apparently there was a rumor while he was gone in Egypt that Antiochus had been killed. Nobody's going to be happier about that than the Israelites, the Jews at this point. We might as well just call them Jews. That's kind of their identity at this time. The Jews are thrilled that Antiochus is dead, even though it's only a rumor, but they think he is. And so they start rebelling against Antiochus' forces that have occupied Jerusalem and have been doing their thing. They start causing an uprising in Jerusalem because of this rumor that Antiochus is dead. It gets to the point that Antiochus can't continue his Egyptian war because of having to come back and settle things in Palestine and with Jerusalem and the Jews. So Antiochus interrupts his work and comes all the way back to Jerusalem in order to try to quell the uprising with the rumor that he was dead. He's certainly going to show them he's not dead. This was also part of this trying to rebel against Antiochus, is while Antiochus was gone, Jason tried to reinstate himself as the high priest and kicked out Menelaus and had him detained while Jason took back over. And all of that was part of it. But when Antiochus returned, he quells the revolt that was led mostly by Jason trying to take back the high priesthood, puts Menelaus back in his place. But in the process, because this all centered around the high priesthood at the temple, Antiochus loots the temple, takes many of the sacred items out of the temple and the wealth that's there, and Menelaus actually helps him to do this. So it is that's just one more irritant with the Jews and Antiochus, and why Antiochus is so hated amongst the Jews. We read some of that in 1 Maccabees chapter 1, verse 20 through 24, describes some of this very action. We read, and Antiochus turned after striking Egypt in the 143rd year, and he went up against Israel and Jerusalem with a fierce army, and he entered the sanctuary in arrogance, and took the gold altar, and the lampstand for the light, and all its accessories, and the table of presentation, and the drink offering cups, and the bowls, and the golden censers, and the veil, and the crowns, and the golden adornment applied to the face of the temple walls. He peeled it all off. And he took the gold and silver and the valuable accessories, and he took the hidden treasures that he found, and having taken everything, he departed to his land, and he made a massacre and spoke with great arrogance. So here is Antiochus IV Epiphanes. Remember, that great arrogance is because that word Epiphanes means he's thinking himself as an embodiment of a god. And so this action against the temple plus his identifying himself as a god is all part of this picture. Verses 29 through 30, the first part of verse 30. At the appointed time, he will return, and he will come into the south, but it will not be as it was before. And the ships of Kittim will come against him, and he will lose heart, and he will turn back. So there is now an appointed time for him to come back into Egypt. It was not the appointed time earlier, but now it is. And now things are different than the first time. And actually, it was just about a year after his last successful invasion of Egypt. This is Antiochus IV going back into Egypt. Those ships of Kittim is another term for Rome. So these are another Roman intervention on behalf of Egypt against Syria. And this time it was different for a couple of reasons. One is that the two brothers, his nephews, Ptolemy the VI and Ptolemy the VII, actually made a truce with each other and started a co-regency in Egypt at the instigation of their sister, who was Cleopatra II. Another Cleopatra. So Cleopatra II, their sister, orchestrates a peace between her two brothers so that they are both co-regents of Egypt and allied, particularly allied against their common enemy, their uncle, Antiochus IV. And so they are allied. Not only are they allied against him, but they have the reinforcements of Rome at their disposal now. And so in just a year's time, Antiochus has a completely different experience when he gets to Egypt. Instead of basically being able to walk in and reestablish himself in these fortifications, he's opposed. He can't make any effort. And he suffers another embarrassing defeat in front of the Romans. I love that one reference that talked about this was, let me just read this from the commentary on the Anchor Yale Bible commentary on Daniel. The ships of Kittim were carrying a Roman delegation headed by Gaius Pompilius Lanus. It was this gentleman who, in the name of Rome, ordered Antiochus to leave Egypt forthwith. When Antiochus tried to temporize, which I had to look that one up actually, that means stall for time. When Antiochus tried to temporize or stall for time, Pompilius, adding insult to injury, drew a circle around Antiochus and demanded a decision before the king stepped out of it. Antiochus, of course, did not disobey, and so with knuckles sharply rapped and pride deeply wounded, he returned home, or as our author has it, he will lose heart and retreat. This did not improve Antiochus' mood at all, and so the next time, when he once again goes through Jerusalem on his way back to Syria, Jerusalem gets the brunt of his anger, and this time, frustration and humiliation. In verse 30b, he will be enraged against the Holy Covenant, and he will take action, and he will turn back, and he will pay attention to those who forsake the Holy Covenant. So his enraged against the Holy Covenant, he's probably blaming those Jews for distracting him the first time, because he was on a roll the first time and he had to come back and interrupt that in order to handle the Jews. And now when he goes back into Egypt, he's completely frustrated and stymied, and the Romans humiliate him. And so he's just going to again vent his wrath against them. And here again we read in 1 Maccabees chapter 1, verses 44 through 50. And the king sent documents in the hands of messengers to Jerusalem and the cities of Judah to withhold burnt offerings and sacrifice and drink offering from the sanctuary, and to profane Sabbaths and festivals, and to defile the sanctuary and holy things, and build altars and shrines and idols, and sacrifice pigs and common animals, and to leave their sons uncircumcised, to make repulsive their souls with all impurity and profanation, so as to forget the law, and to change all their duties. And whoever should not act according to the word of the king would die. So he's blaming, of course, he's blaming the Jewish religion, because it was a high priesthood, the struggle over this high priesthood, the core of their religious practice, that was what incited the Jews in the first place. And so, again, he thinks if I could just eliminate this Jewish religion, we'd be okay. If we could just all do the Greek thing and follow multiple gods and not be so obsessed with this one God, then maybe. And so he makes Judaism basically illegal in Israel, in Judah. Well, in verse 31, we read, the military forces from him will occupy and will profane the sanctuary stronghold, and they will abolish the regular burnt offering, and they will set up the abomination that causes desolation. And that's the ultimate undermining of the Jewish religion, is setting up a false altar on top of the altar of sacrifice in the temple. And that is echoed in Maccabees, 1 Maccabees 1:54 and 55. We read, on the 15th day of Chislev, on the 45th year, they built an abomination of desolation on the altar. And in the cities around Jerusalem, they built altars, and at the windows of their houses and in the streets, they burned incense. So this is the altar, the abomination of desolation, the altar on top of the altar in the temple. Thank you for joining me today in the study in the book of Daniel. If you found this study helpful, please add a comment under the YouTube video. If you have a question or want to discuss something in more detail, hop over to Facebook and find the Storeroom of Scripture discussion group where we can further the discussion. Or you can email me directly at storeroomofscripture@comcast.net. Thanks again, and I hope you'll join me in our continuing study in the book of Daniel as we unpack the treasures in the biblical text.